In Luke 16, verses 19 through 31, we find one of my favorite stories that we find in all of God's Word. We find the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Now, some people look at this and they refer to it as a parable, but I do not believe that it is. I believe that this is a factual account, and that Jesus was allowing us to have just a small glimpse into what this intermediate period is like between the time that we pass away and the time that we stand before the judgment seat of Christ. I do not believe that this account bears the markings of a parable. But what we see in this story is a contrast. We find two different things, two different types of people. We see a rich man and we see a beggar named Lazarus, both in this life, and then we see their status after death. The rich man lived in extreme luxury. He bore purple and fine linen, referring to the most expensive clothing that money could buy. This was clothes that was fit for a king, and the expression lived in luxury implies that he continuously lived in it. The fact that there was a gate suggests that this was a large estate rather than just simply a house. This man was extremely wealthy and would parallel the super rich of today's time. The description of Lazarus suggests that he was completely destitute. He was a beggar and he was laid at the rich man's gate. More than likely, he was disabled and was placed there by friends in order to beg for the necessities of life. He was afflicted with some type of skin ailment. We're told that his body was covered with sores. And these were probably ulcers or some other type of open running wounds that would have been very disturbing not only for Lazarus, but to those who would be seeing these things as well. The only relief that he received was when the dogs would come and would lick at his wounds. Lazarus longed for the food that was being wasted by the rich man, that which fell from the rich man's table. It was a common practice in those days for wealthy people to use bread to wipe their hands and then throw that bread out onto the floor. Well, even this was denied to this beggar Lazarus. Now, this story does not teach that wealth or riches are inherently evil. Remember, both Abraham and Job were rich men. And neither does it teach that being poor is a virtue. The details tell us nothing of the rich man's character, but we can infer that he did not show kindness toward Lazarus. Lazarus was not good or righteous simply because he was poor. His goodness is implied by the image of the angels receiving him in death and taking him to be with Abraham. This is the image of a feast with Lazarus seated next to the host of the feast. And the Jews expected to be in Abraham's presence when they died. And Jesus used this to illustrate his story. But the rich man also died. And when he opened his eyes, he found himself in torment. Hell is translated from the Greek word that is often translated Hades. Hades is similar to the Hebrew word Sheol and usually describes the grave or the place of the dead. In the New Testament, Hades is also used to describe that intermediate state, that place where the wicked go when they die. And this seems to be how Jesus is using it here. He talks about there being two realms, there being paradise and there being heaven. This poor beggar, he was richly blessed, in that his soul was carried by a company of God's angels away into the paradise of God. And we often use this parable to teach about what happens after death. But the main point of this lesson is this. In this life, the rich man probably had everything that his heart desired, but he chose to keep it all for himself. He did not mistreat Lazarus, he simply ignored him. Day after day he would pass Lazarus by and had no compassion upon him. And as far as we know, he never took the time to offer him one shred of assistance in any way. He was not condemned so much for what he did, but for what he failed to do. Friends, we want to thank you for joining us for our program today. We hope that God blesses you today with a wonderful day, and we extend an invitation to you to join us this evening at Pyburn Street Church of Christ at 6 p.m. for midweek Bible studies.